It was a cold, rainy night in the heart of Chicago, the kind of night where the streets glistened under flickering streetlights and the air felt heavy with loneliness. Margaret Harper had just finished her shift at the hospital. As an ER nurse, she was used to long hours and tough days, but tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the chill that seeped through her coat or the emptiness of the roads as she drove home. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change her life. As she approached a dimly lit intersection near an old, abandoned building, something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a pile of trash blown by the wind. But then she saw movement, a slight shuffle, almost unnoticeable. She slowed down her car and squinted through the rain-streaked windshield. That's when she realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a child. Her heart skipped a beat. Pulling over to the curb, Margaret stepped out into the freezing rain. Her boots splashed through puddles as she hurried toward the figure huddled under a torn cardboard box. Closer now, she could see it was a boy, no older than 8 or 9. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. He wore a tattered jacket that did little to shield him from the biting cold. His face was pale, his lips blue from the icy weather, and his wide eyes darted around nervously as if expecting danger. "Hey there," Margaret said softly, kneeling beside him. Her voice was gentle, trying not to startle him. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled the blanket tighter around himself as if it could protect him from more than just the rain. Margaret noticed how his hands trembled. Whether from fear or cold, she couldn't tell. She reached out slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "It's all right," she reassured him. "I'm here to help." For a moment, he just stared at her, his eyes searching hers for some sign of trustworthiness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "Tommy." "What?" Margaret asked, leaning closer so she could hear him over the sound of the rain. "My name," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm Tommy." Margaret smiled warmly despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Well, Tommy, I'm Margaret. Do you have somewhere to go? Someone waiting for you?" He shook his head quickly, his wet hair sticking to his forehead. There was no hesitation in his response, which told Margaret everything she needed to know. This boy was alone. Without thinking twice, Margaret took off her coat and wrapped it around him. "Come on, let's get you out of this rain." She held out her hand, half expecting him to pull away. To her relief, he hesitated only briefly before slipping his small, trembling hand into hers. Leading him to her car, Margaret opened the passenger door and helped him inside. The warmth of the heater hit them both like a wave, and Tommy leaned forward instinctively, soaking up the heat. Margaret grabbed a towel from the back seat and handed it to him. "Here, dry off a bit while I figure out what we're going to do next." Driving away from the deserted street, Margaret glanced at Tommy occasionally. His head was bowed, his shoulders hunched, and his silence spoke volumes. She wanted to ask questions. What had happened to him? Where were his parents? But she knew better than to push too hard, especially when someone was clearly traumatized. So instead, she focused on making him feel safe. By the time they reached her apartment, Tommy had stopped shivering, though his expression remained guarded. Margaret lived in a modest one-bedroom flat on the 3rd floor of an old brick building. It wasn't much, but it was clean and cozy, filled with books and plants that gave it a welcoming vibe. She ushered Tommy inside and immediately set about preparing a warm meal for him. While the soup heated on the stove, she rummaged through her closet for some dry clothes. They were far too big for him, but they would do for the night. Handing them to him, she pointed toward the bathroom. "Go ahead and change. Take your time." When Tommy emerged wearing her oversized sweatshirt and pajama pants, he looked smaller somehow, swallowed up by the fabric. But there was also a hint of relief in his posture, as if the simple act of being dry and warm had lifted a weight off his shoulders. They sat together at the tiny kitchen table, eating quietly. Margaret watched as Tommy devoured the soup, his hunger evident. Once he'd eaten enough to satisfy his immediate needs, she decided to try talking again. "So, Tommy," she began gently, Can you tell me what happened? How did you end up on the street? At first, he didn't respond. He stared down at his bowl, his fingers tracing the rim absently. Then, in fragments, he began to speak. His mother had died when he was very young, leaving him with his father. But his father wasn't kind. He drank too much and often left Tommy locked in their cramped apartment for days at a time. One day, his father simply disappeared, leaving Tommy behind without a word. With nowhere else to go, Tommy had wandered the streets, surviving however he could. Margaret listened intently, her heart breaking with every word. When he finished, she reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "You're safe now," she promised. "I won't let anything bad happen to you." That night, Tommy slept on the couch, cocooned in blankets. Margaret stayed awake longer than usual, sitting by the window and watching the rain fall. She thought about the boy asleep in her living room, the boy who had been discarded by the world, and made a silent vow to herself. No matter what it took, she would give him the life he deserved. Little did she know, this decision would not only change Tommy's life but hers as well. The days that followed Tommy's arrival at Margaret's apartment were a delicate dance of trust and patience. Margaret knew she couldn't rush things. The boy had been through more in his short life than most people endure in a lifetime, and the scars, both visible and invisible, ran deep. He was like a frightened animal, always on edge, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. But Margaret was determined to show him that not everyone in the world meant harm. Every morning she woke up early and made breakfast, setting a plate for Tommy even if he refused to eat much. She'd sit across from him, chatting about mundane things, the weather, her work at the hospital, or the stray cat that sometimes visited her balcony. At first, Tommy barely responded, offering only one-word answers or silence. But Margaret didn't mind. She understood that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. She just kept showing up day after day, hoping that her consistency would eventually break down the walls he'd built around himself. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Margaret handed Tommy a sketch pad and some colored pencils she'd picked up from the store. "I thought you might like these," she said casually, placing them on the coffee table. "You don't have to use them now, but whenever you feel like drawing or writing, they're here." Tommy glanced at the items briefly before looking away. Margaret could tell he wasn't ready yet, but she left them there anyway, a quiet reminder that she believed in his ability to express himself. A week later, she found him curled up in a corner of the living room, carefully coloring a picture of a house surrounded by trees. It wasn't perfect, in fact, it was far from it, but when he showed it to her with a shy smile, Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. "That's beautiful," she told him honestly. "Is this what your dream house looks like?" He nodded, hesitantly, then added, "It's got a big garden, and no locks on the doors." Margaret swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. She realized how deeply his past experiences had shaped his idea of safety and freedom. From that moment on, she made sure never to lock the front door unless absolutely necessary, wanting Tommy to feel secure in their home. As weeks turned into months, tiny breakthroughs began to happen. One afternoon, while Margaret was cooking dinner, Tommy surprised her by asking if he could help. She handed him a knife and taught him how to chop vegetables safely. His movements were awkward at first, but soon he grew more confident, laughing softly when Margaret teased him about his uneven carrot slices. For the first time since he'd arrived, Margaret heard genuine laughter escape his lips. It was music to her ears. Another milestone came when Tommy finally opened up about his mother. They were sitting outside on the fire escape, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret had been talking about her own childhood, sharing stories of her late parents and how much they meant to her. Encouraged by her openness, Tommy spoke about his mom, a kind woman who used to sing lullabies to him every night before bed. Her voice, he said, made everything okay, even when times were tough. She loved flowers, he added quietly. She used to grow roses in pots because we didn't have a real garden. The next day, Margaret took Tommy to a nearby nursery. Together, they picked out a small potted rose plant and brought it home. They placed it on the windowsill in the living room, where sunlight streamed in during the mornings. Whenever Tommy looked at the plant, Margaret noticed a flicker of peace in his eyes, as though a piece of his mother lived on in their little apartment. Despite these moments of progress, Margaret knew there were still hurdles ahead. She reached out to social services to explore options for Tommy's future. Initially, she thought adoption might be straightforward. After all, he clearly needed stability and care. However, the process proved to be anything but simple. Social workers visited their home multiple times, asking questions and scrutinizing every aspect of their lives. Some expressed concerns about whether a single woman in her mid-40s could provide the structure and guidance a young boy like Tommy required. Others wondered aloud if relatives might step forward to claim him. But as the investigations dragged on, it became clear that Tommy had no family willing or able to take him in. His father remained missing, and extended family members either couldn't be located or weren't interested in getting involved. Faced with this reality, Margaret made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. She decided to adopt Tommy herself. The road to adoption was long and challenging. There were mountains of paperwork, interviews, background checks, and court hearings. Margaret often stayed up late filling out forms, her hands cramped from writing, her mind racing with doubts. What if they said no? What if someone decided Tommy deserved better? Yet through it all, she held on to one unwavering belief, that she could give him the love and support he so desperately needed. During this time, Tommy continued to blossom under her care. He started attending school regularly, thanks to Margaret's persistence in enrolling him despite his initial reluctance. At first, he struggled to fit in, feeling out of place among classmates who came from stable homes. But Margaret encouraged him to keep going, reminding him that education was a key to unlocking opportunities. Slowly but surely, he began to find his footing. Teachers praised his curiosity and determination, saying he had potential beyond measure. On the day the judge officially declared Tommy her son, Margaret cried tears of joy. So did Tommy, though he tried to hide it by burying his face in her shoulder. As they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, Margaret felt a sense of completion she hadn't known she was missing. This boy, once lost and alone, was now hers, not legally but emotionally and spiritually. And in return, he gave her something she hadn't realized she craved: purpose. Over the years, their bond only deepened. Margaret introduced Tommy to new experiences, taking him to museums, teaching him how to ride a bike, and planting vegetables in the community garden. In turn, Tommy brought light into her life, filling her days with laughter and wonder. On weekends, they baked cookies together, the smell of vanilla wafting through the apartment. Sometimes they'd spend hours reading books aloud, losing themselves in fantastical worlds far removed from their own. Through it all, Margaret reminded Tommy often that he was loved. "You're my greatest gift," she'd say, hugging him tightly. "Don't ever forget that." And Tommy, though he rarely said it out loud, began to believe her. As the years rolled by, Margaret and Tommy's lives became intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. Their bond wasn't just one of mother and son. It was a partnership, a friendship, and a shared journey toward healing and growth. Every day brought new challenges, but also moments of pure joy that made everything worth it. One summer, Margaret decided to teach Tommy how to ride a bike. It had been an idea simmering in her mind for months, but she hadn't found the right time to bring it up. One weekend, while they were cleaning out the storage closet, she stumbled upon an old bicycle buried under piles of boxes. It was rusty and covered in dust, but Margaret could see its potential. She spent hours scrubbing it clean, oiling the chain, and inflating the tires until it gleamed like new. When she presented it to Tommy, his eyes widened with surprise. "You're teaching me?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. He'd never ridden a bike before, and the thought of balancing on two wheels seemed impossible. Margaret grinned, ruffling his hair. "Of course, you'll be zooming around in no time." They headed to the park early the next morning, the air crisp and cool. The streets were still quiet, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker passing by. Margaret held onto the back of the bike as Tommy tentatively climbed on, gripping the handlebars so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Relax," she encouraged him gently. "You've got this." For the first hour, Tommy wobbled and nearly fell more times than he could count. Each time, Margaret caught him just before disaster struck, her hands steady and reassuring. By mid-morning, frustration began creeping into his voice. "I can't do it," he muttered, throwing his hands up in defeat. "Yes, you can," Margaret replied firmly. "Let's try again. Just focus on pedaling. I've got you." And then, almost magically, something clicked. As Tommy pushed down on the pedals, the bike glided forward smoothly. For the first time, he felt the thrill of momentum carrying him along. Margaret let go without him noticing, jogging behind him silently. When he finally realized she wasn't holding on anymore, he shouted with excitement, "I'm doing it!" "Look at me," Margaret laughed, clapping her hands. "You did it, see, I told you." That moment, the look of triumph on Tommy's face was etched into Margaret's memory forever. It wasn't just about riding a bike. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of overcoming fear and doubt. That lesson stayed with him as he grew older, shaping the way he approached life's obstacles. School became another arena where Tommy started to shine. Margaret had always emphasized the importance of education, telling him stories of how knowledge had opened doors for her when she was younger. At first, school was overwhelming for Tommy. He struggled to keep up, with classmates who seemed light years ahead academically, but Margaret refused to let him give up. Every evening they sat together at the kitchen table, working through math problems or practicing spelling words. She celebrated even the smallest victories, a slightly higher grade on a test, a compliment from a teacher, and reminded him that progress, no matter how slow, was still progress. By middle school, Tommy began finding his footing. His teachers noticed his sharp mind and curiosity, especially during creative writing assignments. Writing quickly became his favorite subject, a place where he could pour out his thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. Margaret bought him notebooks and pens, encouraging him to write whenever inspiration struck. Late at night, she'd often find him scribbling furiously in bed, lost in his own world of imagination. One evening, Tommy shyly handed Margaret a short story he'd written. It was about a boy who lived in a dark forest but eventually found his way to a bright, sunny meadow. Margaret read it slowly, her heart swelling with pride. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. The forest represented Tommy's past, while the meadow symbolized the hope and happiness he'd found with her. "This is incredible," she told him sincerely. "You're such a talented writer. Have you ever thought about sharing your stories with others?" Tommy shrugged, suddenly bashful. "Maybe someday." But Margaret didn't let it rest there. She submitted one of his pieces to a local youth writing contest, knowing he'd never do it himself. Weeks later, when Tommy came home from school holding a certificate declaring him a finalist, his shock turned into pure delight. For the first time, he realized his words had power, not just for himself but for others too. Despite their successes, life wasn't without its struggles. Money was tight, and there were days when Margaret worried about making ends meet. Working long shifts at the hospital left her exhausted, but she never complained. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered, providing Tommy with stability and love. On weekends, they'd visit thrift stores together, searching for hidden treasures among the clutter. They learned to stretch every dollar, turning simple ingredients into hearty meals that filled their bellies and warmed their hearts. There were also reminders of Tommy's painful past that surfaced unexpectedly. Once, during a thunderstorm, he woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Margaret rushed to his side, holding him close until the tremors subsiding. In those moments, she reminded him that he was safe now, that nothing bad could reach him here. Over time, the nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared completely. Margaret understood that some scars ran deeper than others, and all she could do was offer unwavering support. As Tommy entered high school, he blossomed into a confident young man. He joined the debate club, played soccer, and continued honing his writing skills. Margaret attended every game, cheering loudly from the sidelines and proudly displayed his trophies on the living room shelf. Yet, despite his achievements, Tommy remained humble, always crediting Margaret for his success. "You're the reason I'm here," he told her one evening as they sat on the couch watching TV. "If you hadn't found me that night, I don't know where I'd be." Margaret smiled, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. "Don't give me all the credit. You worked hard for everything you've accomplished. But none of it would have happened without you." He insisted. "You saved me." She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "No, Tommy, you saved yourself. All I did was give you a chance. The rest was all you." Their conversations like these became more frequent as Tommy grew older. He began to understand the depth of Margaret's sacrifice and unconditional love. She had given up so much for him, her free time, her savings, her peace of mind, and asked for nothing in return. The realization filled him with gratitude, but also a desire to make her proud. When senior year arrived, Tommy threw himself into applying for colleges. Margaret helped him draft essays, proofread applications, and prepare for interviews. Together, they dreamed of universities far beyond their little Chicago neighborhood. One afternoon, as they sorted through acceptance letters spread across the dining table, Tommy picked up an envelope stamped with the logo of a prestigious university across the country. "I got in," he said quietly, almost as if he couldn't believe it himself. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Tommy, this is amazing. You deserve this more than anyone." He hugged her tightly, overwhelmed by emotion. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream big, to imagine a future full of possibilities. And yet, beneath the excitement lay a pang of sadness. Moving away meant leaving Margaret behind, and the thought terrified him. Sensing his hesitation, Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to be scared," she said. "But remember this. You're ready. You've got everything. You need to succeed. And no matter where you go, I'll always be here for you." Tommy nodded, blinking back tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." In that moment, they both knew the next chapter of their lives was about to begin. While Margaret prepared herself to let go, Tommy prepared to step into the unknown. But one thing was certain. No matter how far apart they were, their bond would remain unbreakable. The day Tommy left for college was bittersweet. Margaret had spent weeks preparing for it, packing his clothes, labeling boxes, and even sneaking in a few handwritten notes to tuck inside his suitcase. She wanted him to feel her presence even when he was miles away. But as she stood at the bus station watching him hoist his backpack over one shoulder, her heart felt heavy. Tommy hugged her tightly before stepping onto the bus. "I'll call you as soon as I get there," he promised, his voice cracking slightly. He tried to smile, but Margaret could see the same nervousness in his eyes that she felt in her chest. "I know you will," she replied, forcing herself to sound cheerful. "And don't forget, I'm only a phone call away if you need anything." As the bus pulled away, Margaret waved until it disappeared around the corner. Then she turned and walked back to her empty apartment. For the first time in years, it felt eerily quiet. The absence of Tommy's laughter, his footsteps, and even the occasional clatter of dishes being washed echoed through the space. Margaret sat on the couch, staring at the rose plant they'd bought together all those years ago. Its vibrant blooms seemed to mock her loneliness. Still, Margaret reminded herself that this was what she had always wanted, for Tommy to spread his wings and chase his dreams. Over the next few months, they stayed in touch regularly. Tommy called almost every evening, sharing stories about his classes, professors, and new friends. Margaret listened intently, asking questions and offering advice whenever he needed it. Sometimes their conversations lasted hours, just like old times when they used to sit at the kitchen table talking about everything under the sun. But distance wasn't easy. There were moments when Margaret missed having Tommy close by. The late-night talks, the shared meals, the simple comfort of knowing he was safe in the next room. On weekends, she found herself wandering aimlessly through the house, picking up objects that reminded her of him. A book he'd left behind, a photo of them at the park, or the bike still leaning against the wall outside. Each item brought a mix of pride and longing. Meanwhile, Tommy was navigating life on his own for the first time. College was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He thrived in his writing classes, earning praise from his professors for his unique voice and storytelling ability. His classmates admired his determination and kindness, quickly welcoming him into their circle. Yet despite his growing independence, there were nights when homesickness crept in. One such night, Tommy sat alone in his dorm room, staring out the window at the dark campus below. The silence pressed down on him, making him ache for the familiar warmth of Margaret's apartment. He picked up his phone and dialed her number without thinking twice. "Hey, Mom," he said softly when she answered. "Are you awake?" "Of course I am," Margaret replied, her tone instantly concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Tommy assured her. "I just, miss home, that's all." Margaret smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Well, I miss you too. But tell me something good today. What made you happy?" Tommy hesitated, then began describing a creative writing workshop he'd attended earlier that day. One of his short stories had been read aloud by the professor, who praised its emotional depth. Hearing Margaret's pride in her voice made him feel grounded again, reminding him that no matter how far apart they were, their connection remained strong. Over time, Tommy adjusted to college life. He joined clubs, made lifelong friends, and discovered passions he never knew he had. During winter break, he returned home for 2 glorious weeks. The reunion was filled with laughter, hugs, and endless stories about his adventures. Margaret cooked his favorite meals, and they spent hours sitting by the fire escape catching up on lost time. "You've grown so much," Margaret remarked one evening as they sipped hot chocolate together. "Not just physically, but emotionally too. I'm so proud of you." Tommy grinned, setting his mug down. "Thanks, Mom. You're the reason I've come this far." By the time graduation rolled around, Tommy had transformed into a confident young man ready to take on the world. He graduated at the top of his class, earning accolades for his thesis, a collection of short stories inspired by his journey with Margaret. When he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Margaret cheered louder than anyone else in the audience, tears streaming down her face. After graduation, Tommy landed a job as a journalist in a bustling city across the country. It was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, but it meant moving farther away from Margaret. As they packed up his belongings and said goodbye once again, Margaret reminded herself that letting go was part of being a parent. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "Make me proud." "I already have," Tommy replied, holding her gaze. "And I'll keep doing it." Life settled into a new rhythm for both of them. Tommy threw himself into his work, covering stories that mattered and using his platform to give a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her routine at the hospital, finding solace in helping others. Though they lived apart, their bond remained unshaken. They spoke weekly, exchanged letters, and visited each other whenever possible. During one visit, Tommy surprised Margaret with a gift, a framed copy of the first story he'd ever written, the one about the boy in the forest finding sunlight. Beneath it, he'd inscribed a note, "To Mom, who showed me the way out of the darkness." Margaret hung the frame prominently in her living room, where she could see it every day. It served as a reminder of how far they'd come, not just individually, but together. Their lives had intertwined in ways neither of them could have predicted, shaped by love, resilience, and countless small acts of kindness. Years passed, and Margaret grew older. Her hair turned fully gray and her body slowed down, but her spirit remained as fierce as ever. She often thought about Tommy, wondering what new adventures awaited him. Little did she know, fate had one more surprise in store, one that would bring their journey full circle in the most unexpected way. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air feels cool against your skin and the leaves crunch underfoot. Margaret had just finished her dinner, a simple plate of pasta with garlic bread, and was settling into her favorite armchair, by the window. She loved this time of day when the world outside slowed down and the golden light of sunset bathed everything in warmth. It reminded her of quieter moments with Tommy, back when he was younger and they'd sit together watching the sun dip below the horizon. As she sipped her tea, lost in thought, there was a knock at the door. At first she thought she might have imagined it. Visitors were rare these days. Most of her friends and co-workers knew how much she valued her evenings alone. But then came another knock, firmer this time. Curious, Margaret set her cup down and walked to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing on the other side was Tommy, but not the Tommy she remembered from their last visit. This version of him looked different. He was taller now, broader-shouldered, dressed in a sharp suit that made him look every bit the successful journalist he'd become. Behind him stood a young woman holding the hand of a little girl, no older than 3 or 4. The child's curly hair bounced as she peeked shyly around her father's leg. "Mom," Tommy said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to meet someone." For a moment, Margaret couldn't move. Her heart raced as she took in the scene before her. The boy she'd rescued all those years ago had grown into a man, standing on her doorstep with a family of his own. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped forward, pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at you." Tommy laughed, hugging her back just as fiercely. When they finally pulled apart, he gestured to the woman beside him. "This is my wife," he said proudly. "We met at work a few years ago. She's amazing. She's the reason I'm still sane after covering some tough stories." The young woman smiled warmly, extending her hand. "It's such an honor to finally meet you," she said. "Tommy talks about you all the time." Margaret shook her hand, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "Welcome to our home," she managed to say, though her voice cracked slightly. Then, her gaze shifted to the little girl hiding behind her father's knees. "And who is this beautiful angel?" Tommy bent down, gently lifting the toddler into his arms. "This is Lily," he said, his tone softening as he looked at his daughter. "She's the light of my life," Lily giggled, reaching out to touch Margaret's cheek. Instinctively, Margaret reached up to hold the tiny hand, her heart swelling with love. There was something familiar about the child's bright eyes and curious expression. It was like looking at a younger version of Tommy. Come in," Margaret urged, stepping aside to let them enter. As they settled into the living room, she bustled around, fetching snacks and drinks, trying to steady her racing mind. How could she possibly put into words what this moment meant to her? Once everyone was comfortable, Tommy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "There's something I need to tell you, Mom," he began, his voice serious. "Something important." Margaret froze, suddenly worried. Was everything okay? Had something happened? Seeing the concern on her face, Tommy quickly added, "No, it's nothing bad, I promise. Actually, it's the opposite." He glanced at his wife, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "We didn't just come here because we missed you. We came to thank you for everything you've done for me, for saving my life." Margaret blinked, stunned. "You don't have to thank me," she protested weakly. "I didn't do anything special." "Yes, you did," Tommy insisted, his voice firm. "You found me when no one else cared. You gave me a home, a future, and so much more. Because of you, I got to build a life worth living. And now?" He paused, glancing at Lily, who was playing quietly with a toy car on the floor. "Now I get to pass that love on to her." His words hit Margaret like a wave, overwhelming her with emotion. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. All these years, she had wondered if she'd truly made a difference in Tommy's life. Now sitting here surrounded by his family, she realized the answer was clearer than ever. Before she could respond, Tommy handed her an envelope. "This is for you," he said. "Open it later, okay? Just read it when you're alone." Margaret nodded, clutching the envelope tightly. Whatever it contained, she knew it would mean the world to her. They spent the rest of the evening talking and laughing, catching up on each other's lives. Lily warmed up quickly, climbing onto Margaret's lap and chattering endlessly about her toys and drawings. Watching the little girl's joyful face, Margaret felt a sense of completeness she hadn't known she was missing. This was what family felt like, Not just blood ties, but a bond built on love, trust, and shared experiences. As the night wore on, Tommy and his wife helped Margaret clean up before gathering their things to leave. Hugging her goodbye, Tommy whispered, "We'll be back soon, Mom, promise." "I'll hold you to that," Margaret replied, squeezing him tightly. After they left, Margaret sat alone in the quiet apartment, cradling the envelope in her hands. For a long time she simply stared at it, replaying the evening in her mind. Finally she opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was handwritten in Tommy's neat, familiar script. "Dear Mom, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully express how much you mean to me. You didn't just rescue me from the streets, you gave me hope. You showed me what unconditional love looks like, even when I didn't believe I deserved it. Because of you, I learned to dream again. And now I've named my daughter after you, Lily Margaret. She carries your strength, your kindness, and your spirit. Thank you for being my mom, my hero, and my greatest blessing. Love always." Tommy. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, she understood that her decision to take in a frightened boy all those years, Ego, hadn't just changed his life. It had changed hers too. Their journey had come full circle, proving that love has a way of creating ripples that last a lifetime. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. The next morning, Margaret woke up with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in years. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind like a cherished memory: the knock on the door, Tommy standing there with his family, and the letter that had left her heart overflowing. She couldn't stop thinking about little Lily, whose laughter still echoed in her ears. Margaret decided to make the day special. She went to the market early, picking out fresh ingredients for a big family dinner. She wanted Tommy, his wife, and Lily to come back, not just as visitors but as part of her home. As she walked through the aisles, selecting vegetables, fruits, and spices, she found herself smiling at strangers, unable to contain the joy bubbling inside her. When she returned home, she spent hours cooking dishes she knew Tommy loved. Spaghetti, with meatballs, garlic bread, and a creamy chocolate pudding for dessert. The apartment filled with the comforting aroma of simmering sauces and baked goods. Every chop of the knife, every stir of the pot, felt like an act of love, a way of saying, "Thank you," without words. By late afternoon, Tommy and his family arrived just as promised. This time, Lily ran straight to Margaret, throwing her arms around her legs. "Grandma," she squealed, using the nickname she'd decided on during their last visit. Margaret laughed, crouching down to hug the little girl tightly. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, brushing a strand of curly hair from Lily's face. "Did you miss me?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "I brought you something," she announced, pulling a crumpled drawing from her pocket. It was a colorful picture of a house with stick figures holding hands outside. In the corner, written in wobbly letters, were the words, "For Grandma." "Oh, Lily," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "This is the best gift anyone has ever given me." Tommy watched the scene from the doorway, his eyes glistening. He exchanged a glance with his wife, who smiled knowingly. They both understood how much this moment meant, not just to Margaret, but to all of them. As they sat down for dinner, the table buzzed with conversation. Tommy shared stories about his work, describing some of the people he'd interviewed and the impact their stories had made. His wife talked about her job teaching art to kids, while Lily entertained everyone by pretending to be a chef, serving imaginary plates of food. Margaret listened intently, soaking in every word, every laugh. For the first time in years, the silence that usually lingered in her apartment was replaced with warmth and connection. After dinner, they gathered in the living room, sipping tea and flipping through old photo albums. Margaret pulled out pictures of Tommy as a child, the scrawny boy with wide, uncertain eyes who had once huddled under a blanket on her couch. Seeing those images now, alongside the confident man sitting beside her, filled her with pride. "You were so brave," Margaret said, pointing to a faded photo of Tommy learning to ride his bike. Do you remember how scared you were at first, but look at you now, you're fearless? Tommy chuckled, shaking his head. Not really, he admitted. I still get scared sometimes. But I think about everything you taught me. How to keep going even when things feel impossible. That's what keeps me moving forward. His words struck a chord deep within Margaret. She realized that the lessons she'd tried to instill in him hadn't just helped him survive. They had shaped him into the person he was today, and now he was passing those same lessons on to Lily. Before they left that evening, Tommy handed Margaret another envelope. One more thing, he said with a mischievous grin. Open it tomorrow, okay? Curious but trusting, Margaret accepted the envelope and hugged them goodbye. As she closed the door behind them, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life she'd built, the son she'd raised, and the legacy of love that continued to grow. The next day, Margaret opened the second envelope after breakfast. Inside was a note along with a small key. The note read, "Dear Mom, I know you've always put others before yourself, but it's time you let someone take care of you for a change. Use this key to open the storage unit downtown. Everything inside belongs to you." Confused but intrigued, Margaret grabbed her coat and headed to the address written on the back of the note. When she arrived at the storage facility and unlocked the unit, she gasped in disbelief. Inside were boxes upon boxes filled with mementos from Tommy's childhood, drawings, report cards, trophies, and even the bike they'd learned to ride together. But there was more. A large wooden chest sat in the corner, its surface polished to a shine. Opening it, Margaret discovered stacks of cash and documents detailing a savings account Tommy had set up for her. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the floor, overwhelmed by the gesture. Tommy had been planning this for years, quietly setting aside money to ensure she'd never have to worry about finances again. It wasn't just about the money, it was about giving her the security and peace of mind she deserved. That weekend, Margaret invited Tommy and his family over once more. This time, she cooked her favorite recipes, determined to show them how much she appreciated their love and thoughtfulness. Over dessert, she thanked Tommy for the gift, though words felt inadequate. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know, I'm proud of the man you've become. You've given me more than I could ever ask for." Tommy smiled, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "You already repaid me a long time ago, Mom, by loving me. That's all I ever needed." As they sat together, surrounded by laughter and love, Margaret realized that life had come full circle. The frightened boy she'd found on the street had grown into a loving husband and father, while she had gone from being alone to having a family she cherished more than anything. Their bond wasn't just one of blood. It was forged through sacrifice, trust, and unwavering devotion. And as she tucked Lily into bed that night, reading her a bedtime story, Margaret knew one thing for certain. Love may begin with a single act of kindness, but its ripple effects can last a lifetime.